Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to another episode of the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. I try to stay away from comparisons to the Holocaust, but it was hard on Saturday when looking at the photos of Eli, Or, and Ohad, who returned from Gaza emaciated, frail, and weak. These images need to be seared into our collective conscience to remember why Hamas needs to be eliminated and why we need to continue as a country bringing all of the hostages home. That's the topic of today's episode. I'm joined by two of my JPPI colleagues, Professor Michal Siegal and Professor Gil Troy, to try to understand what did those images and what did the release of these three hostages on Shabbat, on Saturday, do to the Israeli people, who are now torn between a mix of, the one hand, celebration for the rescue of these people, for returning them to their homes and bringing them back to their families, or in the case of Eli and Or, what remains of their families, but also with the pain knowing that the time and the lives of those hostages who remain languishing in Hamas captivity is limited. And every day that passes, every minute, as a matter of fact, puts at risk more and more of the hostages who are still there and are waiting for us, for Israel, to bring them home. We talk about Prime Minister Netanyahu's decision to remain in Washington, D.C. over the weekend as this hostage release was taking place. We talk about the political situation that his coalition is in as Israel debates whether to move from stage one to stage two of the hostage deal. And what does that mean for the end of the war and for the failure, as of now, to replace Hamas and help put in place a new governing entity over the Gaza Strip that would see Hamas removed from power and taken away from the Gaza Strip. A lot to unpack, heavy with emotion, but stay with us. Hi, Michal. Hi, Gil. It's great to have you both back on the podcast.
Hi.
Great to be with you.
So we're talking just shortly, a day after the release of three male hostages, Or, Ohad, and Eli. And the images, of course, I think struck everyone around the world, but definitely us Israelis and probably Jews everywhere they are. But you saw that really the responses by governments also to just these images of frail, emaciated, weak men who clearly had been starved during their almost 500 days in captivity raises a lot of questions, of course, of what is happening to the rest of the hostages who remain in captivity. And are we now on the in a process, or I guess, or on the verge of getting another batch potentially this coming weekend where we will see even worse images of the hostages? Like we saw the first initial were the women mostly who came back, and they looked, at least on the outside, to have been fed. They looked like they were pretty much similar to the way they were taken. But these men are skeletons of what they once were. Not to mention the fact, of course, the own personal story of Or, whose wife was murdered at the Nova Festival, coming back to his young 3-year-old son, and Eli Sharabi, whose wife and 2 daughters were murdered. And then to even hear the stories of how both men were what kept them alive to some extent was this hope that they would be returning to their loved ones. And for Eli Sharabi in particular, to know after being released that there's no one left from his immediate family. I mean, just totally heart-shattering beyond words. But I'm curious to kind of get both of your thoughts, obviously seeing these images, watching them as they happened. There's an overwhelming sense of different variety of emotions, of the failure, but the success. I talk about how I often think of how the hostage releases is, on the one hand, a celebration that we're able to rescue people and bring them home. But on the other hand, the price that we are paying, the fact that Hamas is still there and in charge to some extent, and now to see what state and condition they're in. So, Michal, I'd like to start with you and just kind of get your thoughts of what you were thinking yesterday as you saw these images and these men come home.
First of all, we had, I think the thing that was harder on us watching it live was the disconnect between our leadership and the people watching it. Our literal leadership was in the United States sleeping or at least spending time in a five-star hotel and not bothering to come back and see that with us. So I think our some parts of our leadership was worried about that reaction that we're seeing, even though we knew and we suspected that that might be the case. Seeing it in and with our own eyes is a hard one. And I think something that we're not only are we worried, sick, and devastated for the families and the people themselves and the reality they're coming back to, these are pictures of defeat. That needs to be said. Israel is seeing with its eyes something that you don't even see when there's dead bodies, right? You don't see the bodies, they're buried and you see funerals. But here you see the results of a failure. There was a massacre, there were hostages taken. We're seeing with our own eyes our defeat, our weaknesses. This is something that's very, very hard to see, even for people who are not from the families of the hostages, even though we fought for them and we want them back, and there is a vast majority among the people in Israel to pay a very, very steep price for their release. Um, there's something about seeing them and realizing we lost. We lost in a specific battle. I don't know if we lost the war, but we lost. And that's a hard one, which might explain, by the way, why some views say we shouldn't be doing this deal because that deal admits defeat. The lingo is we shouldn't be sacrificing future sacrifices for the release of these, hostages because we're releasing terrorists, which is a valid point. But some of those people claiming that are all for military campaigns that will lose for sure soldiers for the lives of the hostages. That we're okay with. And what's the difference between the two? The difference is the position of power. Are we doing this? An exchange of hostages for terrorists is an admission of defeat. We want our hostages back and we were defeated. And that's something that's very hard for people to say, and as opposed to a military, operation that will be very heroic and for sure is gonna, kill some hostages and kill some soldiers and not even be able to be sometimes be successful. That's a difference. And the image of seeing the hostages coming back, being very happy for their families and some kind of closure, but at the same time seeing them coming back this way and knowing that we're releasing, convicted terrorists and horrible people, some of them in return for those hostages and seeing the situation they're in is a picture of defeat, and that's a very, very tough one to see and realize, and that needs to be taken into account when we're considering some people calling for the stop of these views, even for the price of the people's life and their families, and even though there's a vast majority of people who want to pay that price, I think that's in the background of hearing the voices of people who want to stop this from keep happening every week.
Gil, do you agree with Michal that what we saw is that image of defeat?
Before I get to that, let me say two things. First of all, look at the way you framed it, Yaakov. You talked about, you mentioned the hostages by their first names, and that sense of personal connection to them, whom we've never met. I've never met any of these hostages, but I feel that personal connection is something that we kind of take for granted, but actually is quite extraordinary. And I think I may be particularly appreciating it I'm speaking to you from Ottawa, where it's Super Bowl Sunday. And the focus on the coverage in my fitness room this morning was much more about Super Bowl Sunday and the commercials and all that. And so I'm feeling this weird disconnect, and I'm actually deeply moved by how much we love each one of those individuals. And Michal, I want to pick up on, if I kind of charted out what you said, it wasn't contradictory, but it was complex. And I appreciate the complexity, because we're all with these up and down emotions. Anyone who kind of says, oh, it's so simple, and doesn't see, as you do, the incredibly high price we're paying, what was 134 horrific terrorists. And what we really saw yesterday was evil. We looked at the face of evil as reflected in these three human beings, and the contrast between their gaunt appearances and what they looked like on October 7th is heartbreaking. I will respectfully disagree. On the one hand, yes, the images are defeat, and they throw us back to the trauma of October 7th, and and I think it was Or who was kidnapped from the Nova Festival, and on Israeli television they showed again the heroic nature of Anir Shapiro, one of our neighbors, all three of us, who threw the 7 grenades back, and so it took us right back to October 7th. On the other hand, and this is heartbreaking to say, part of the reason why they're so gaunt, and part of the reason why they suffered so much, partially is political failure, but partially because them being released now, as opposed to in May, as opposed to when Hezbollah was still terrifying us, as opposed to when Iran looked much stronger than it has been after now it's been weakened, and as opposed to Syria before it was collapsed, is very different. So on the one hand, we do have these images of defeat. On the other hand, I actually think we've done an extraordinary job in restoring some of, if not much of, the deterrence that we lost at that moment. And so that adds perhaps another dimension of the complexity.
No, I totally agree that obviously this is very complex. And when I look at the macro picture, and I'm actually working on a piece as we speak that kind of looks at the macro picture and talks about, yes, how we have changed in the last 16 months, the reality here in the Middle East. What I do think is that when Israelis are looking at these images, and Michal is expressing that feeling to an extent, is there's the feeling definitely that how did we fail these people specifically? And we saw, for example, I don't know if both of you watched or read the interview that Yoav Gallant, the former defense minister, gave over the weekend to Channel 12 and to Yediot Ahronot, where he spoke about how it's pretty much the same deal that was on the table back in the spring, back in the summer, that we could have brought home more hostages. There were those who were then alive and now unfortunately are dead. And if I recall correctly, according to the army, 35 are verified dead, but the fear is that more are unfortunately no longer among the living. They just don't have the evidence to be able to determine them 100% dead. But you had on the one hand, so that's that personal failure to these individuals and to the others who will no longer come home. But then there's also the collective failure to an extent of the nation that look what we did to some extent. And I kind of feel this also. 16 months we battled these guys, and look at how they stand up. They put on a procession. They put on a show. They know how to hold a rally. They're still there with their AK-47s. They got their green bands wrapped around their heads. I mean, Hamas is still in charge. So, Michal, when we look at like the failures of what the government did here, and you went back to October 7th, of course, and Gil went back to October 7th and talked about how this returns us there, obviously, with the Nair connection. But, I mean, the government is to blame. Is Hamas to blame? Who would you pick to put your finger on here?
Obviously Hamas. Like this is a starting point, and saying, all those left people are angry at the government and not on Hamas doing it. No one is, no one is denying the fact that, well, except some people, but most people don't deny the fact that Hamas is pure evil, and is, there's devastation and its goal, the devastation of Israel, fine. But we put this, for example, aside. But we've been saying, and world leader has been saying to our leadership that we have to work on an alternative, some kind of alternative. And selling the perfect victory or complete victory to the people of Israel with no possibility of some kind of, some kind of in-between way, someone else, the Palestinian authorities, of even UNRWA or the Red Cross, even the people we have to work with who are far from being perfect in this situation. If we don't give an alternative to the Hamas, we're back to October 6th. This is exactly the situation that brought us where we are. And the horrible thing is that there was some point, even for me as a cynic, left-wing person, at some point in the beginning of all this, there was a moment when I thought that the horrific acts of October 7 might lead to a global peace here, because everyone will realize that Hamas, how horrible Hamas is, and everyone will come together to create something else. And I didn't take into account how badly we're led by our, no view to the future, no thinking of that, only on the the next 5 minutes, not to say that we're collaborating, God forbid, with the Palestinian authorities or thinking with the other Arab countries in the region, and that led us to where we are. And that was expected. So seeing Hamas is awful and horrible and scary. I saw pictures today, 300 meters from the Yishuvei Otef. I want to say that in English,
The kibbutzim, the communities along the border. Yeah.
we are seeing Hamas operative on the border today. There were pictures in Twitter today of their coming back to close to the border. This is scary and horrible, and not to talk about the north as well. But this is not good. Having said all that, and I want to be very, very clear about this. We owe a debt of solidarity and brotherhood to our kidnapped and to our kidnapped's family to first and foremost take care of that. Hamas on the border is a horrible thing. We tried to take care of it for, a year and a half. We didn't do the best job we could. Could we have done better? Yes. Could we have done completely better, of a complete victory? I don't think so, but we tried. But for first and foremost, we owe a debt of solidarity to our brother. This has always been the case. In Jewish history, I'm a Jewish professor, Jewish studies professors, give you ample examples, always, solidarity to people who were kidnapped from a music festival, from their houses, from their homes, and bring them back, first and foremost, even at the price of seeing, as I said, the failure to our face, this horrific act of, we haven't even talked about the fact that they led a young woman through a mob, seeking, to murder her while she was passing through that, while they're doing the exchange. All of those horrible sights that we're seeing, eye on the ball. We need them back home. We need them here, because this is what makes Israel, Israel, and this is what makes the Jewish people, the Jewish people. This is what makes humans, is the solidarity. And then we need to take care of all the rest. And it's very hard to do when you have to admit defeat. And that's what happened.
It's our strength and our weakness to an extent. I was trying to explain to someone today, a foreign diplomat stationed here, how our strength is the length we go to and the price we pay to return our people. But it's also our weakness, because as we see time and again, Hamas and others take advantage of it. But I do want to...
By the way, Yaakov, this is not new. We have responsa from medieval times where, the local leaders needed some money. He would take someone from the Jewish community, raise money for ransom. Everyone knew this was the case. And if they pay their ransom, that will give incentive for the local leaders all over Ashkenaz to do it again. Even so, they kept doing it. They kept ransoming, they kept paying the ransom, because this is what Jews do. This is our weakness and our strength. Always been the case. It's not even debatable. Always in Jewish response all through the centuries. And the conversation about the validity of that's kind of new. That's new. In Israeli and Jewish conversation is new. The fact that we might not want to do that.
Because that comes with sovereignty, I think. The conversation comes with when you are the person, you're the entity in control. When you're not the entity in control, you're the Jew living in the shtetl. Maybe that's the difference.
We've done this for 75 years. This is the first era in modern Jewish history where we're saying, no, we're thinking ahead, and we decide to give up on those people. And we don't want to see those skeletons coming back, because that is admitting defeat, and we're not willing to do so.
Gil?
First of all, there was this little problem with Gilad Shalit, who was traded for over 1,100 terrorists, many of whom went back to terror, including Sinwar. So I don't think it's just a matter of wanting to give up on our values or wanting to not having uncomfortable images of defeat, but these are people who then go back to killing. And so the question is, even morally, philosophically, Jewishly, how do you balance out the saving a human life in real time versus the potential loss of life from these killers who love to kill 5, 10, 20 at a time? So it's just, I want to just bring in that dimension of complexity. I also want to go back to your original question, Yaakov, and talk about, I was very struck by the Gallant interview. I'm not an insider, I have no idea. But I read the Atlantic Council speech that Secretary of State Tony Blinken gave in his last days as Secretary of State, and the exit interview he gave to the New York Times. And the way he framed it, not me, The way he framed it was, to the New York Times, he said explicitly, this is an exact quote, where was the world? He said, if the world had put more pressure on Hamas, and the world had put more pressure, I'm adding, on Qatar and on Turkey, we might have had a very different story over the last 16 months. And then he said very explicitly in the Atlantic Council speech, Hamas were the spoilers. And so I go back to the start, and I agree with you, Michal, about the evil not only of the mobs, but also that while they're freeing Eli Sharabi, they whisper to him that his brother was killed. I mean, and then these certificates they give. So the cruelty of our enemy is something that we have to factor in strategically, and morally, and philosophically, and theologically. So that's one dimension. Secondly, I see those images of their arrogance and their AK-47s, but I want to point out two other things. One, as of my reading of the hostage agreement, this version of the hostage agreement, Israel controls an 800-meter buffer zone, which separates my cousin from Kibbutz Nirim, who hasn't moved back yet, and all the people on the Otef from the Hamasnikim, and I think that's really important that we hold on to. I think that's actually very important in the negotiations for two reasons. One is because it physically gives the safety that they didn't have on October 6th. And secondly, it would be, if it's formalized, the first loss of Palestinian territory, of Arab territory since 1967. And I think that unfortunately, too many Palestinians, not all, I'm careful not to categorize, but too many Palestinians don't speak the language of life, but speak the language of land. And similarly, when I watch this display of arrogance, and I'd even use the phrase, Michal, toxic masculinity at its absolute worst, evil, I don't think the Palestinians are that stupid. I think many Palestinians see the incredibly high cost they've paid in human life. I think many Palestinians see the incredibly high cost they've paid in what Gaza looks like today. I think many Palestinians see what the high cost they've paid in now this conversation that Donald Trump, either purposely or mistakenly, who knows, has triggered. And so I think it's just more complicated. And I think it's very easy for us to go to criticism of the government, and I have my criticism of the government. I think it's very easy to go to a sense of defeat. But I think after 16 months, we really did our best under very, very difficult situations. Because, Michael Oren put it very well. He said, we lost the war on October 7th. And every day since, we've been trying to kind of claw something back. And that's why I at least try to say, we do have a deterrence restored. We have made tremendous progress, probably the way Joe Biden and his farewell address to the State Department boasted about, without taking any responsibility for the degree to which he inhibited Israel while also empowering Israel. It's just so what Israel has had to manage in these last 16 months has been very complicated. And we're all in real time. And it's very hard. We all know. I mean, I love it. You don't speak in decades. You speak in millennia, right? So we don't have to wait 1,000 years to know what happened, but we do have to kind of see how this still rolls out.
But I also want to add to that and something Michal touched on, and I think that here might be one of the cardinal mistakes of our government. And trust me, I totally agree with you, Michal, about the prime minister not being here over the weekend, and we'll get to that in a moment, because that's just disturbing on many different levels. But when you have leadership that presents to you a total victory, what they called nitzachon muchlat, right? This idea that we will eradicate Hamas, we'll destroy Hamas, that through military operations we will save and rescue the hostages, that the military solution is the ultimate solution, and there is no need for a political process, right? Although it goes against all military theory and strategy over millennia as well. But when your government is pushing that and your leaders push this, and then your people come to see what happened, for example, on Saturday, and put aside for a moment, as difficult as it is, the frailty of the hostages themselves, but to see Hamas put on these rallies and these show of force, it makes you say, 1 second, so we did lose because they're still there. We don't have that total victory. But let's take for an example for one moment, what would have happened had responsible government and leadership been in place, had said to us from the beginning, listen, we're not going to be able to destroy Hamas. It's not possible, right? Which, by the way, I'll open a parenthesis for a moment. When Donald Trump tweeted last week that America will take ownership over Gaza after Israel finishes fighting Hamas, but we won't put any soldiers in Gaza, what exactly does that mean? That just goes to show it's not a plan, because what point do you finish fighting Hamas? Hamas will always be there, right? You'll never finish fighting Hamas. You need to have someone else be there to stop Hamas from rising up. So if it's not American soldiers, it's got to be the Palestinian Authority, the Saudis, someone else, who I don't know who it is. But I think that was one of the great mistakes that the government made and set us up for just complete disappointment. And I know why Bibi did it also. So I blame him, but I also understand him. He did it for politics.
Why are you talking in past tense? We're hearing reports of his conversation with Trump this week when he was talking about stopping the process until Israel gets rid of Hamas. This is an actual reports coming in from Washington. We're not done with this. We're not done with this attempt to get rid of Hamas for the price of the remaining hostages. This is not done. He's not done with this. And he has a fraction of the population that brought him to power. We have to say this is his base that wants him, and his colleagues in the Memshala, who, by the way, are sending very strong messages that if that happens, they are back in the Memshala and keeping him in the government, for much longer. And we're hearing that this is back on the table to stop the process until Hamas is out. It's very hard to admit defeat. It's horrible to admit defeat. And I'll tell you why it's so horrible. Honestly, it's more than just ego. We cannot deal, this is, even coming from the left, I cannot ignore the fact that trying to hang on to some kind of a toxic masculinity idea of a complete victory actually threaten my life. Because if I'm not dealing with the actual threat of a remaining Hamas on the ground, by the way, inside the occupied territories as well. But if we're not dealing with the fact that Hamas is here to stay and we have to deal with that, how do we deal with this? The best way we can, and how we protect our kids. Because we're hanging on to some fantasy that we'll go in and we'll bomb them all and we'll kick them all out and we'll blah, blah, blah. Nothing of this is going to happen, obviously. And so we're going to kill the hostages and we're not going to be safe at the end of the process. This is what scares me so badly of this whole process. And knowing, by the way, it's not just strategic planning. It's even, the military can't win if there are no goals, political goals in place. If you don't, the army has said a few times, and you hear the military commanders are like, we don't know what we're doing here. And it has been like this close to a year, and by the way now. They came back and they re-cleaned the same area over and over and sustained casualty distinctly because there was no plan. And the problem with no plan is that it would endanger my future here and my family in this country. That's the problem with that. Besides killing all the hostages and their family and betraying the trust that we gave to our citizens, that we will keep them safe and get them out in whatever way we can. Keeping that aside, my future here is in danger because we're not looking at the reality to its face. We're not being realistic here. And that scares me very, very much.
So, Gil, following up on what Michal is saying, I was listening to Bezalel Smotrich today, who there was a thought, or there was a point last week when Donald Trump rolled out this idea / plan / pipe dream, whatever you want to call it, about America taking an ownership position, I quote, over the Gaza Strip and taking control of Gaza. That seemed like, wow, Netanyahu's coalition has been saved. He could do anything. He could even go to a second stage in the deal because everyone's going to be holding on to this hope of the complete evacuation of the Gaza Strip. Ben Gvir was making sounds that he might actually be coming back into the coalition, even if, let's say, the hostage deals were to continue, because the fact that we now have maybe annexation even in 4 weeks, as Donald Trump said. He'll get back. He's thinking about it. He needs 4 weeks to think about it. On the other hand, over the last couple of days, we started to hear, and Smotrich even today said, we will not be forced into a deal. We will not give up everything, because he was talking about how what happens if, for example, they kidnap and take more hostages and then demand the evacuation of the West Bank and demand that we pull out of the communities and the settlements in Judea and Samaria. So Smotrich is already going back to that point. How do you read the political dilemma that Netanyahu is facing?
Look, I completely agree with Michal that we need and have been lacking mature leadership. And we've been talking about this podcast since we started 16 months ago, that Hamas is an idea and a movement and you can't eradicate it, that it took the United States of America almost a decade to find Osama bin Laden, And from the start, we needed a more realistic framing of our goals. But let's talk militarily and let's talk politically. Militarily, I think even without that without that articulation, it doesn't deny the many successes and the restoring of deterrence that has occurred. And as with so many of us have neighbors and friends and children who are fighting. What they report from the front is that even though they have indeed had to go back sometimes, they also have ground down more and more of the combatants, and ground down more and more of the command and control centers. Yaakov, you're the military expert on the call. You can talk about the tremendous achievements that we've had. And so I think we have to put the frustration that we have with pie in the sky articulation of goals so that the politicians are happy with very impressive military achievements that they'll be teaching in West Point for the next decades. Excuse me. So that's one dimension. Politically, from the start, and I don't mean from the start of the war, I mean from the start of the coalition, the instability of the coalition was constantly making Bibi look weaker than he thought he wanted to be, and has brought out a weakness in his leadership, I'm sorry to say. And so right now how it's going to play out is very difficult to know. And now you have this Trump factor where in many ways it seems some days that the functioning prime minister of Israel is not Smotrich, is not Ben Gvir, is not Yaakov, is not Michal, but is Donald Trump. And that Donald Trump is kind of setting the stage. And that's never good, both as a Zionist or in general when we talk about sovereignty. And so what do we do? I think that's a real question. How do we go forward? And my maybe too optimistic, but always trying to be constructive approach is I think what the most helpful thing that Donald Trump did with his who knows again how elaborate or impulsive a plan is, was at least get us thinking, what is going on and how many kind of fundamental assumptions we just sort of built into the conversation. 2 states for 2 people. UNRWA, Red Cross, all these people. Go back to the conception of October 6th where we were saying, Hamas is pragmatic. We can deal with the Palestinian Authority. So now what do they call it? The Reformed Palestinian Authority. Well, just adding the name Reformed to Palestinian Authority isn't reform. And so what I want to do is I want to take all this chaos and start getting us going back and asking what are some of the blind spots we've had? And not just us, but the international community has had, and certainly I'm here in Ottawa, the Canadian community has had, that keeps perpetuating the problem. And can we build off what Trump has started talking about and try to create really thoughtful, new, creative solutions? We're the startup nation people. And one of the things that's been so frustrating for me in the last 20 years is as genius as we are when it comes to all the little high-tech things, we're just not that smart when it comes to our politics.
But Gil, I don't want to burst the bubble, and I do want to be optimistic like you. But here's the reality for a moment. This government and this prime minister, but all throughout recent history in Israel refuses to make the tough decisions, right? Netanyahu has had multiple opportunities over the years to annex parts of Judea and Samaria, aka the West Bank, has refused to do it. He's had multiple opportunities to sit down with Abu Mazen and try to hammer out a deal. He's refused to do that too. He is the one constant in Netanyahu's life is the caution, the hesitancy, and the fear to make extreme and radical decisions. By the way, you see that just over the weekend with the Gallant interview, although we knew this before, the paralysis that overtook him after October 7th, the fear of the number of soldiers that would be killed if we go send them into Gaza. We ultimately did send them into Gaza. It wasn't as bad as he had thought it would be. The fear of what would happen if we try to take out and launch a preemptive strike against Hezbollah. It dragged on. Finally, we did it. It wasn't as bad as we thought it would be. But Netanyahu, that is the constant throughout Netanyahu's career. He doesn't attack Iran. He talks a lot about Iran. He had multiple operations against Hamas, never sent in ground troops. The only time he did was in 2014. He was forced to do it. And of course, now after October 7th, he's always been very, very, very cautious. And to some extent, by the way, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think that the decision, and here getting back to what you were saying, my problem is, and I agree with you 100%, Donald Trump has now a plan, right? Barack Obama had a plan. Joe Biden had a plan. George Bush had a plan. Bill Clinton, of course, had a plan. But I always ask, do you know the the Ehud Barak plan, the Ehud Olmert plan, the Ariel Sharon plan. Well, that was the disengagement, but the Benjamin Netanyahu plan. We don't have plans. We just follow whatever we're told by the Americans, and that's just a complete negligence, I think, in my opinion, of what leadership is meant to be.
It's more than that, because I think you're being very, logical, and you're ignoring something very fundamental here. We have a leader that's on trial for corruption. We have a leader who's hanging, by a thread on his government, and is pleasing and coming. By the way, if you look at his career, he's gone back on every single stand he had, economically and security-wise and everything. So it's not just about being afraid to make decision. It's about his motives, his ideology. Why is he doing what he's doing? And we have enough information at this point to realize that it's not in the best interest of his people. And I'm going back to something that I've started with. I don't know how, in whatever country in the world, in the Western world, and not in a dictatorship, that something like what happened on Shabbat happens. There's a release of hostages that we've been waiting for a year and a half, and our leader stays over with no need, by the way, in a 5-star hotel, and it doesn't, not to speak of the fact, can you imagine after 9/11 that someone doesn't, that Bush hasn't
Michal, I don't want to interrupt you, but do you know how many times Bibi has been in America since October 7th?
How many?
3 times.
Three
Do you know
times.
how many times he's been to Nir Oz since October 7th? 0.
Yeah, so I'm saying this is something. By the way, I have a disagreement with my left-wing friends. This is not a good enough leader from the opposition. This is not enough. He's like, he's very parv. He's like right-wing, whatever. I'm like, at this point, I just want a leader with a heart. I want someone who I feel feels the pain of the parent. I never thought I would live in a country where there will be animosity towards parents of kidnapped parents, or people who have lost their kids. This is not the Israel I was brought up in. We have a leadership that has no soul, no empathy, and this scares me more than anything else. I have to tell you the truth, more than anything else. I would take anyone to replace our current leadership, someone who has a heart, who looks at it. How can they not take part of what we've all been through this past Saturday, watching those people come back so starved and horrible, and no one? How is Bibi not on the ground waiting to them, to hug them, to look to into the faces when they realize their families has been murdered and killed on his watch? Are they not there to hug the families?
And say sorry and apologize. Yeah.
You know what? Just be silent. Be there. Show you have a heart and you care. He literally stayed in a 5-star hotel and slept through this ordeal. No, we're so beyond that, because we've seen so much we don't even realize. This is like the worst dictatorship in third world countries, maybe. I can't, like, how will we normalize this? How?
Yaakov, if you think I'm pie in the sky by waiting for some kind of constructive plan and vision and creativity, you're pie in the sky by waiting for an apology. That's going to take even longer. Look, I just want to add 2 nuances. One, the thing is that it's not only the 5-star hotel, because the truth is that with words, with empathy, it could have come even from Washington. It could even come from a 5-star hotel. So for me, I agree with you, but the issue is much more the ongoing distance from the complexity and from the pain and from the failure. But I also just want to say that I think one of the great things we've learned in the last 16 months, and I say in the positive way, is that we have learned that our society is better than our leaders, and that we are not our leaders. And I trust to you, my fellow friends on the call, to our colleagues, to our miluimnikim, our reservists. They're the ones who've been saving us again and again. And at the end of the day, they used to say, a country gets the politicians they deserve. No, that's a curse. And what we have to make sure is that eventually the society gets the politicians we deserve, but we have to first right now focus on the fact that our society is so much stronger than it was 16 months ago, and our society has been able to endure this despite too many of our leaders, and we have to start challenging them to make sure that we have leaders who are worthy of the amazing reservists we have and the amazing parents who have done what they can, and to move heaven and earth to save our country, but also save our soul.
Well, I think the one thing that we can all definitely agree on this call is how this is the most urgent thing, right? Everything else is it's important, but really at the end of the day, when you think about where we are in this point and whether we won the war, we didn't win the war, it's a failure, it's a victory, we changed the region, we didn't change the region, that can all wait for another day potentially. What cannot wait are the people who are languishing in Hamas captivity. We saw that front and center on Shabbat, on Saturday, when Or and Eli and Ohad were released. These people are there's a clock ticking, and if they're not brought home soon, there will be no one to bring home. That's the reality. And I mean, I'm not even getting into the fact that the leadership that's still here, how they're still in office after the failures of October 7th, is beyond me on so many levels. I mean, the lack of accountability, of taking responsibility, is just so appalling in of itself. But here's just bring back the people you can save. Do the basic thing. What Michal said, and I think that's very interesting, what Jews have been doing for millennia, that is something that we should just keep doing, because at least that we know how to do. We know how to bring them back, and we should do what we can, and that should be our victory for now. So I want to thank you both, Michal and Gil. Thank you so much for joining us. And to all our listeners and viewers, you can find us always where podcasts can be found, on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and of course the website of Times of Israel. We will be back with another episode of the Jewish People